Hey Bookaholics, and welcome back to another video. Today I am bringing you my r/fantasy, my Reddit fantasy bingo board. I participate very loosely in the sense that I just read and then I go back and I see if I can find things to fit the prompts. It turns out that this year I actually did really well inadvertently. I think there were only 2 squares that I didn't get the hard mode on, which is pretty cool. I am going to go through what book works for each of the prompts and brief thoughts. For those of you who don't know, I'm going to leave a link to the fantasy down below. The new one is going to be starting in April. So the way that this works is we have a bingo board that is 5 by 5 and you try and complete as many prompts as possible. So we have the bingo period, which lasted from April 1st 2023 through to March 31st 2024. You cannot use the same book more than once on the card, and you cannot repeat an author except if that author is part of an anthology for a different square. Only one square can be a reread. It cannot be non-speculative. It has to be speculative in some way, shape or form, be it speculative, horror, fantasy, sci-fi, magical realism, etc. If a self-published book is picked up by the publisher and it doesn't count as self-published, you can listen to it, read graphic novels. The format does not matter. And you can read novellas, but it kind of asks you to do so, bearing in mind that this is a challenge and the idea is that you are supposed to be pushing yourself and therefore reading things that are a bit more intimidating or a bit more challenging, and for most people novellas are not challenging. But that is all of the rules. So I'm going to start going through and I'm going to go through each of the books that I have read. The first tile says title with a title. So read a book in which the novel contains a job title, military title, or title of nobility, such as locksmith, lieutenant, or lord. This title can be something that is bestowed upon the character, such as hero, or it can include fictional titles that are only in the setting. For example, Legend Born by Tracy Dion. And the hard mode is not a title of royalty. So I have gone with Shaman's Crossing by Robin Hobb, as Shaman is a title. This is the first book in the Soldier Sun series by Robin Hobb. I sadly did DNF the second book, but it's a soft DNF. It's not one that I can give up on because Robin Hobb wrote my favorite series of all time, which is The Realm of the Elderlings. So I'm very tempted to keep trying the series and see if I can make it work, but it kind of was just like a shoe that wouldn't fit at the moment, which was really sad. It's a Western sort of inspired fantasy in which we have a Native American versus colonialism style narrative going on. There were interesting perspectives. The society, I just didn't like the protagonist. I found that all of the things that I hate about Robin Hobb's characters, because I love the characters for all of their other attributes, they get away with having these very glaring flaws. You know, you have Fitz's mopiness and moodiness. You have Winthrop, that you can still read their perspectives even if you disagree with them or even if an abundance of personality flaws. I just didn't find that there was anything redeeming enough about Nivar for me to push through all of the things that annoyed me about him. So I do want to give it another go, but as it currently stands, it's a series DNF. The next tile is superheroes, a story that focuses on superpowered individuals like heroes and villains and capes, etc. And hard mode is not DC or Marvel. I don't review graphic novels on here anymore. I did mention them. I think the last lot of graphic novels that I mentioned was when I read them for Magical Readathon, and that was solely because I read them for Magical Readathon. So any graphic novels that I do read, because I read them really quickly, so it's not even like it's to justify why I've slowed my reading down or whatever, I just haven't reviewed them because it's not something I know how to review, and it is something that I also read just for the joy of it because it's such a quick experience as well. It tends to be a good palate cleanser. So I haven't actually talked about this on the channel, but I have read The Boys by Gareth Ennis and illustrated by Derek Robinson. This is the first volume, omnibus volume. This is the graphic novel that the TV show The Boys is based on. The Boys is a what if in our society with capitalism we had superpowered individuals. It's very morally questionable. We have some very, very villainous, very intense characters in The Boys. I did read this and I do prefer the show. I'm not going to be continuing on. I'm not going to be buying any more volumes. There are, I think, 2 more omnibus volumes. I'm not going to be purchasing them. I liked it enough, but I prefer the show. I think that the characters are brought more to life in the show, and I cared more about the characters. I find them more interesting. The humour lands better. One of the things that I did find really interesting though is that the protagonist in this one is actually British. So the character that's played by Jack Quaid in the show is actually British in this, which I didn't know. But other than that, like, there's not a huge amount of difference. I definitely think that Butcher especially is done much better in the show. So as much as it was fine, and I'm glad that I read it, and I'm glad that I sampled the source material, I have no need to spend 30 quid times 2 to get the other 2 volumes when it was just fine. Tile number 3 is bottom of the TBR. Read one of the books that has been on your to be read pile the longest. If you do not keep a TBR, read one of the books that you have been meaning to read for the longest time and haven't yet. And then hard mode, there is none. It says actually finishing a book that you've been putting off for so long is already hard enough, which thank you very much, Reddit Fantasy. For this, I've gone with one that I have now had on my TBR for 10 years, and that is A Game of Thrones by George R. Martin. I read it for a project that I did last year. I still kind of need to iron out exactly what I want to do with that project, but I read it for a project last year. We have owned since I still lived in the UK. I'm fairly certain that we got this in 2013. So over a decade ago, we purchased this book and I finally read it. I gave it a low 4-star. I understand the hype and I understand why people enjoy it. But as I want to do this project, I'm not going to really review this book because I read it with a purpose. So I think once you know my purpose, you'll understand where my thoughts are better. So I'm hoping to get that project out at some point, and I really do want to discuss it, but I just really need to iron out my thoughts because it feels like quite a big project, and also it's talking about some of the very, very big names of series in fantasy. So I don't want to then be the kind of person that doesn't have clear thoughts when talking about these things. For now, I will leave it at I thought it was okay, it was a decent enough book. I'm going to continue on with the series, but I'm in no rush for obvious reasons. Tile number 4 says magical realism or literary fantasy. Read a book that portrays magical or unreal elements in an otherwise realistic or mundane environment. These books are often found in the literary fiction shelves and book lists and not always shelved as genre fiction. It is hard square to pin down, as what makes something literary or magical can often be down to vibes, so use your best judgment. No saying A Game of Thrones is literary fiction since there aren't a lot of magical elements. Check out this thread for further ideas and guidelines. So then the hard mode is not one of the 30 books that were linked in the aforementioned thread for guidelines. And I have read The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock by Imogen Hermes Goar. This one is a historical fiction that is set in 1785, and we are following a man who wakes up and one of his captains of one of the ships that he owns, because he owns like multiple ships because he works in trade, one of the captains of one of his ships has taken a payment. He sold the ship in exchange for the body of a mermaid, and now this man owns the body of a mermaid. It's where it throws him into high society and the gossip around it and his change in circumstances. And we are also following a young woman who shows interest in him. She comes from lower classes and she's kind of one of those, she's not a gold digger, she's just trying to further her aspirations in a world where the only way a woman can aspire to anything is based on the man that she marries or beds. We have a very interesting dynamic going on in here with this man, and obviously it's mostly historical fiction. The only fantastical element is a mermaid, so I feel like this works really well for this prompt. It was a good story. I ended up, I think, giving it again another low 4 stars, and it was interesting and it definitely read more like historical fiction. So if you're looking for it to read like fantasy, then it's not the book for you. But as historical fiction goes, I think it had really interesting commentary. It had discussions around the ethics that come with things like owning a body, which was interesting as well. So there were very interesting conversations happening, a lot of social critique on the treatment of women, but also it kind of had subtle discussions around exoticizing because of the mermaid, which I also thought were handled quite well because it's not quite so full on. It's like also just, you know, exoticizing human beings. It was discussing the mermaid, but they're definitely transferable discussions, which I thought were very interesting. So overall, it was a good book for discussion. This would make a really good book club book, I think, and I had a good time with it, despite the fact that it had a prose style that is not one that I would normally lean towards, I still had a really good time with it. And the last square on the top row is to read a young adult book. So a book that was written for young adults. And the hard mode is one that was published in the last 5 years. I have one that was published in 2021, and that is A Lesson in Vengeance by Victoria Lee. This is one that is also actually more on the magical realism side, because we have two timelines. We have a timeline in the present in which a young girl has just gone back to the very prestigious school that she attends after having taken a year off following the demise of her girlfriend. And we are following her as she is trying to recover. This other young girl has now started attending this school as well, and she wants to write about the witches that were accused of witchcraft way back when, and they were murdered in the school, and it's supposed to be that these ghosts still haunt the school. The protagonist knows not to tamper with these witches because she's fairly certain that that has something to do with the death of her girlfriend. So we have the two timelines because we are also seeing slowly unfurl what happens with the witches. We are also getting what happened with the girlfriend, and then we have the present timeline with the new girl in the school. This was a bit of a disappointment to me. I do have a vlog where I read it. I have a Dark Academia vlog, I believe it was, and I was a bit disappointed by the ending, and the ending then had a kind of knock-on effect with the hindsight making me like the rest of the book less. I can't really explain why, because obviously it's the ending, so spoilers, but the ending definitely ruined the entirety of the book for me, which was a shame. So I ended up giving it 3 stars because the majority of the book was like a 5-star read, and then the last like 70 pages were just ruining all of the things that I had enjoyed about the book until that point. So as much as there were a lot of things to love and the writing style was really compelling, the atmosphere and setting were really, really cool, there were just a few things that then ruined the book for me personally. Moving on to the second row, the first prompt on it is mundane jobs. So the protagonist has a commonplace job that can be found in the real world, so no monster hunters. We are also excluding soldiers as they're extremely prominent in SFF. However, the hard mode is that the story doesn't take place on Earth. So they have a mundane job that you would find on Earth, but it doesn't take place on Earth, much like Legends and Lattes with the cafe. And I went with The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy by Megan Bannon, as Mercy is an undertaker, which is a job that we have on Earth. This is a You've Got Mail retelling. This is a epic fantasy, so it's set in a different world to ours. We are following Hart, who is a marshal, and therefore he has to kind of re-kill the dead, like you have zombies kind of uprising type things. So he has to go out and re-kill the dead, and then he then brings them to the Undertakers, and he hates Mercy. They hate each other, they can't stand each other, and she is trying to keep her family's business afloat as Undertakers when there is like this big major corporation that is kind of drowning them out. It actually fixed a couple of the problems I have with You've Got Mail as well, which I really appreciated. Miscommunication actually wasn't too bad either, because obviously one of the big tropes that you get from You've Got Mail is miscommunication, and I think that it was handled better in these circumstances, especially because we don't have technology as well, so it's done through letters, which is very cute. I had a really good time with this one. I actually ended up going at 5 stars because I'm not much of a fantasy romance girly, so when one hits home, you deserve all your stars. For the next tile, we have published in the noughties or in the 2000s, a book that was published between the year 2000 and the year 2009. This does not include like reprints, special editions, etc. Published for the first time in the noughties. And then for hard mode, it's not in the top 30 Fantasy's Best of 2023 list, so not one of the really, really popular ones. I have gone with The Steel Remains by Richard Morgan. This is an epic fantasy that starts off the series, I can't remember the series name actually, but it's the start of a new series. It's by the author of Altered Carbon as well, and in it we are following a man who was a soldier all for his country until his country abandoned him, and now he has to go save his cousin who has been kidnapped and potentially is going to get roped into a human trafficking scheme. We're also following the perspective of an advisor to the emperor, who is the last of her kind because she is a half human, half this other species that like left the planet and it left her behind. And we are also following a man who comes from this like religious sect who has specific investment in the ongoing conflict that is happening in his area. And it's epic fantasy, and a lot of the tropes are very epic fantasy. It feels very Joe Abercrombie-esque, but in a really good way. I really appreciated the way that this book tackles grimdark. One of the only things for me is that it started out with an almost literary style to it, and then it kind of dropped it with certain characters, and I really wanted like a literary grimdark that sounded amazing to me. One of my favorite grimdark, actually my favorite grimdark series that I have read, is The Empire of Dust by Anna Smith Spark, which is literary grimdark. So I was really hoping for that. So I ended up giving this 3 stars, but I can't stop thinking about it, and I really want to continue on with the series. I was gonna like leave it as a series DNF, and again, I can't stop thinking about it. So I'm definitely going to continue on with the series, and I think I will reread this one before I read the other 2. And it's entirely possible that my rating will go up, because I think that the book did suffer from my existing expectations as opposed to anything the book actually did wrong. The next tile is Angels and Demons, and the story must feature angels or demons or both in a prominent role, and the hard mode is the protagonist is an angel or a demon. For this one I have gone with Angel Mage by Garth Nix. This was my favourite YA of last year, with a minor caveat which I will get to, but this one was my favourite YA of last year. I had such a good time with this. I thought I was going off YA, not gonna lie. I'm not. I'm just pickier because I loved this so much. This is the story of Lilith, who wreaked absolute havoc so that she could bring her lover, who happens to be an archangel, to life. However, when the tide started to go against her, she basically went into a sleep until she could come back again so that she could start all over again and bring her lover to life. During this time, when she has reawoken, she has set her sights on 4 individuals who she believes will be able to help her reawaken her lover. The protagonists, it's a bit of a stretch with the whole being an angel, but once you've read it, you might understand that this, I think, would still count for hard mode. I don't know. I mean, I'm not submitting my card anyway, but I feel like this works for hard mode. I had an amazing time with this. I loved the way that it was a pseudo-European setting. I love the criticisms that come with religion, especially when it comes to the kind of cultist nature that religion have. And I had such a fantastic time with Garth Nix's writing. I've really missed it. I really need to reread and potentially continue the Old Kingdom series, given how much I loved this book. The dark ambience and atmosphere of it, everything felt like it was just like perpetual night. And I think this is going to be one of those YAs that really does stand the test of time, and I really enjoyed it. The next tile is to read 5 SFF short stories. So any SFF short story, as long as there are 5 of them. The hard mode is to read an entire SFF anthology or collection. I actually had multiple options for this one, so I'm going to talk about the one that I most want people to know about because it's underhyped and I want you all to be checking it out. And that is The Alchemy of Sorrow. This is a fantasy and sci-fi anthology of grief and hope, and it was edited by Sarah Torn and Virginia McLean, and it contains stories from some of my favorite authors. We have ML Wang, we have K.S. Veloso, who was my breakthrough author of last year, love her, long time. We have Quenby Olson, who is the author of the Miss Percy's Pocket Guide series, which again absolutely love, and we have some authors that I was introduced to for the first time. We have Crystal Matar. I had an amazing time reading this. This is the first like collection of short stories of any kind that I have rated 5 stars. And bearing in mind that there are different authors, this is an anthology. It's not a collection of short stories where it's like, oh, I just really dig this author's writing style. This is a collection of short stories, and yet it was done in such a beautiful, such a powerful way. The subject matter is obviously one that is very intense, so content warnings, but it's so beautiful, and even the introduction was just so lovely. It also has illustrations by one of my favorite illustrators, which is Kirsten Espinosa Rosero, and each chapter has its own illustration. Oh yeah, Angela Board also in here. I had an amazing time with this. I want more people to know that this book exists. I want more people to read it. Self-pub short story collections seem to be appealing to me a lot more than traditionally published ones. And the last square that we have on this line, read a book from the horror genre, and hard mode is not Stephen King or H.P. Lovecraft, which was very easy for me to do because I am not interested in either of them. I have Lone Women by Victor LaValle. This was one I ended up rating at 4 stars. The ending is a little bit, I understand, and I understand why people will love it. It's not my thing. But this book was so well written. I really need to read more books by Victor LaValle because, oh my god, the writing style just absolutely mesmerizing. And I feel like Victor LaValle has that kind of writing style because I've read a short story by him before, but this was my first novel of his, and I was wondering if, you know, it was just like an aesthetic thing that he'd done in the short story, but oh my god, you can feel it even more in his novel, obviously. So he just has this writing style that he could write in 20 different genres and you'd just be like, oh no, but this is Victor LaValle. Yet still being true to the genre, like the atmosphere that he established in Lone Women was amazing. It starts out literally with a woman who is in a house where her parents are dead. So she's just preparing their dead bodies and then she sets fire to the house and then she leaves. And that's what we start out with. And that's all you need to know. And I would highly recommend, if you're looking for horror and you read literary fiction, I would definitely recommend checking this out. Moving in to the third row, we have self-published or indie publisher that has not been picked up by a publisher. We have Hard Mode, a self-published book that has fewer than 100 ratings on Goodreads, or an indie publisher that's done an AMA with Art Fantasy, because I cannot believe this has less than 100 ratings. It's nearly there, but I cannot believe this. I went with The Shadow Gate by L.R. McRae, which is the sequel to The Iron Crown. The Iron Crown got a special edition last year, and yet, as of filming this, not even when I read it, because I read it when it had very few ratings because I got an ARC, but as of filming this, it's only got 73 ratings. That's just criminal to me. What? I love this series. It's one of my favorite self-published series out there, and it's one of the most innovative worlds. I love L.R. McRae's writing style because it's so accessible, it's so easy to get through, which means that it cuts off all the fat and you have such a very clear idea of what this really intricate and really interesting world sounds like, feels like, looks like, and I'm here for it. So I'm not going to talk about this one too much because it is a sequel, but the fact that it hasn't got that many ratings is just painful. The next one we have is set in the Middle East, or a Middle Eastern SFF, and it is to read a book that is set in the Middle East or an analogous setting that is based on real world Middle Eastern settings, myths and culture. I have not completed the hard mode in this one because the author is of Middle Eastern heritage. The book that I went with is The Candle and the Flame by Nafisa Assad, because this is one that is set along the Silk Road, but the author is from Fiji. When I talked about Angel Mage, how Angel Mage was my favorite YA, that is solely on the basis that this is technically YA, but I have no reason to believe that this book is YA. It's done by Scholastic, which are normally really young YA as well. I have no reason to believe this is YA. All of the protagonists are over 18. The writing style, though accessible, is absolutely gorgeous and definitely would suit adult readers. And I have not the slightest clue why this book is not listed as adult. If the Daverbad series is listed as adult, this should be. Like, there is nothing in the Daverbad series that is more adult than this, so I don't understand. But we are following a young woman who is from a village that, prior to the beginning of the book, was rampaged by these jinn, these kind of like more evil jinn, and she was one of the few survivors. Now it has been taken over by a different kind of jinn, like the good jinn, and she is now living in this very peaceful city that is along the Silk Road. However, when certain occurrences begin happening, she is tasked with investigating alongside another jinn, and it goes from there. This is a gorgeous book, and I don't just mean the cover, which is one of the most gorgeous things that I own. It's so intricate, it's so intelligently written, it has such incredibly well crafted characters. It's so short, it's a standalone, and yet it's so well written. For everyone that goes absolutely mental over fantasy standalones and how rare it is and how they don't pull it off, this one pulls it off. Like, it's stunning, and it's one of my favorite books of last year. I treat it more like it's adult, but apparently it's YA. But that's why I consider Angel Mage my favorite YA, because to me this is at the very least new adult, if not adult. The next one we have is a book that was published in 2023, so a book that was published for the first time, so no reprints or editions in 2023. And the hard mode is that it's also an author's debut novel, and for this one I have gone with Vevin Song by Jonathan Neves Mayers, and this was his debut. I got an ARC for it, which was lovely. It had a couple of things that go with debut, especially self-pub authors, but oh my god, it was so well crafted. And I think I went in with lower expectations because of me being accustomed to debut, and I don't mean that in the sense of self-pub, I mean generally, you can tell when it's an author's debut a lot of the time. It was really well crafted. It had a really interesting world building, and I'm really looking forward to the sequel. He's just had a kid, so I don't think I'll be getting a sequel anytime soon, because writing when you have a baby is absolute hell. But I'm really looking forward to the sequel whenever it comes out. The next tile that we have is Multiverses and Alternate Realities. Read a book in which the setting contains at least 2 universes, dimensions, planes, or realities that characters within the book can travel between. Multiple worlds in the same physical plane of existence, such as planets within a universe, would not count for this square. And then for hard mode, is characters do not walk through a literal door in order to get to another world. And for this one, I have gone with House of Sky and Breath by Sarah J. Maas. For what it's worth, I gave this book 2 stars. This is the worst Sarah J. Maas book I have ever read. I've heard even worse things about the third one, so I will probably not be continuing the series. I do not like the direction that it's going. And talking of multiverses, that's exactly what I don't like about this series. I'm not going to go into it because there are plenty of people that have still not read it, and spoilers get rampant very quickly in the Sarah J. Maas fandom. I did not like the multiverse aspect of this, but it is present, so I'm going to use it for this prompt. But I have nothing good to say about this, and I am not going to continue talking about it. And the last square that I have in this row is a POC author. So the author must be a person of colour, and for hard mode, the novel takes place in a futuristic or sci-fi world. The one I have gone with is The Iron Widow by Xiran Jie Zhao. This one was another one that was a little bit disappointing for me because I was expecting, it is female rage, it's entirely female rage, but I think I was expecting there to be a lot more of progress and transition, or for it to have been like she's a raging bull from the start. But we have this quite submissive good girl is supposed to do what she's supposed to do suddenly turn into a raging bull. I understand the character's motivations and I understand it for pacing purposes, but for me that just didn't work because there wasn't enough time for me to get to know the original character to then see her transformation. There were just issues that I had with it, so it was a good book, but it just was not for me. And there is one of those that is very much, it's YA and it's for YA readers. I understand that a lot of adult readers also enjoy it, but I think it was a little bit too foundational, back to basics feminism for me as well, so I just didn't get very much out of it, but I had no issue with the book. The next row starts with book club or read along book, and we have any past or active R fantasy book clubs count as well. I went to the site and I found a book that I have read that is for the FIF club, which is Females in Fantasy book club, which looks like a really good book club, and I have since joined the Goodreads read along, but I didn't actually read along. So this is another one of the tiles that I did not complete in hard mode because I didn't join the discussions, but they have read Kaikiyi by Vaishnavi Patel. This is a Indian inspired mythology retelling in which we are following Kaikiyi, who is part of the Ramayana as the villainous evil stepmother character in the Ramayana. This is a feminist retelling, and although it is very intense with its feminism, it is very much like, this is feminist, I am here for it, because the way that it did it with grace and gentility at the same time, and I really appreciated that. It's one of my favorite mythology retelling styles because I love it when we have a vilified female perspective as the protagonist perspective, same as you get with The Witch's Heart and Circe. I much prefer those to, for example, Ariadne, which is like normally the damsel in distress. Less interested in those. I understand their purpose, where it's taking the damsel in distress and making a human being out of them, but I prefer the villainess style retellings. So this one definitely ticked many boxes for me. The next square is To Read a Novella, a book that is between 17,500 and 40,000 words. And for hard mode, it is a novella that is not published by Tor.com Publishing. So for this one, I've gone with a self-published one, which is Songs of Bone by J.R. Snyder. This is the second book in the Sin Eater Tales, which is one of my favorite self-published short story collections or novella series. The first book, which is Season of Ravens, was one of the first books that I was given to review by the author, and I had such a lovely time with that because it's cozy fantasy, murder mystery, epic fantasy, folklore. Like, it's just a wonderful hodgepodge of genres. It's very folkloric setting, and you have, you know, like the witch of the forest, you have the vampire in the castle, you have all of these cool things. In this one we have a ghost ship, and I really love the concept because you have someone that's investigating occurrences with these magical beings, but a lot of the time it's got the Scooby-Doo-esqueness of like, actually humans are also monsters. So it's like if you took The Witcher and Scooby-Doo and could put them in a fairy tale setting. And I absolutely loved that about this series because it's just one that is so wholesome. The protagonist is absolutely adorable. His encounters with these magical beings is also so sweet. And if you are on the cozy fantasy hype train at the moment, this is definitely a series you should be checking out. The next square is Mythical Beasts, which is to read a book that prominently features at least one mythical beast, meaning a creature that does not exist in reality. And then for hard mode is no dragons or dragon-like creatures. So I have gone with Strained Practice by Vivian Shaw. It's an urban fantasy and we are following Dr. Greta Helsing, who is the doctor to the supernatural. So she is a doctor of vampires, mummies, werewolves, ghouls, etc. I had a good time with this series. I wanted to have a better time with this series. The concept sounds funny, but a bit too much emphasis on the romance for my liking. I was not needing the romance, or at least I would have been happy for the romance to have been kind of like in the background, which we can see. Regardless, it was still a fun series and I'm still glad that I read it. And again, the concept is very cool of just you have a doctor, someone who is a medical doctor, but specifically to these different supernatural species. And the next square we have is elemental magic. Primary magic within the world deals with the classical elements of earth, wind, air, water, and fire. And the hard mode is that it's not Shades of Magic by V.E. Schwab or the Codex Alera by Jim Butcher. This one's a bit of a stretch as well, but I went with Year One by Nora Roberts because in this world we've had a plague that has either killed people or given some people magical abilities, and it has an almost X-Men feel to it where you have different people with different magical abilities and then they are hunted, etc. So it's a fantasy dystopian romance that very much has X-Men vibes. So I really liked the X-Men vibe part of it. I was actually less interested in the romance. Because it has X-Men magical power things, it did include elemental magic. So it's not the only type of magic, but it does include it. So I've stuck to that. I'm not sure which book actually had someone who had kind of more elementally kind of magic in it. So I've just gone with the first one, and somewhere in this trilogy there is elemental magic. I don't have a huge amount to say about this trilogy. It's not one that's really stuck with me. It was one that I had fun with while reading, but that was entirely forgettable and I have relatively lackluster feelings about. And the next one that I have is Myths and Retellings, which is to read a book that is based on mythology or pre-existing story, and for hard mode it not be Greek or Roman mythology. So for this one I have gone with Sister Song, which is by Lucy Holland and is based on the Tuatha sisters, which is a Celtic ballad. So it is not Roman or Greek, and it is about during the Roman occupation of Britain. We're following one of the kingdoms that is still pagan, the attempt to convert these people towards Christianity. Really loved this story. I think that it was done in a way that really enhanced Celtic culture. We had a really interesting sister dynamic that you don't see very often because you have both the love and the volatility. Like normally you either have they are rivals and they hate each other, or they are like best friends and they're inseparable. And we had these different personalities that were in conflict with each other, had different aspirations and goals, while at the same time you have these sisters that very much love each other. And I found that really interesting and really well done. It's a tragedy as well, and it's based on a tragedy. And also we didn't have the sisters necessarily falling exactly into the archetypes of sisters that we get. That's one of the problems I have with Rena Rosner, for example, where it's just like there are 3 types of women. It didn't work like that, so I really appreciated that as well. And then the 5th and final row, the first square in that row is a queer norm setting. So a book set in a world where queerness is normalized, accepted, and prevalent within communities. Characters are not othered, ostracized, or particularly remarkable in any way for their queerness. And hard mode is not a futuristic setting, so it takes place in a time akin to ours, or in the past, or in a fantasy world with no science elements. And for this one I have gone with Sword Point by Ellen Kushner. This is the first book in the World of Riverside series, and in it we are following several queer characters, and they are not ostracized for being queer. Now this is one that is on several lists of Queernorm series, and I agree and disagree. So, for example, we don't have marriage between queer people, but you do have people who are openly queer. So I have kind of like a bit of a conflict as to this being called queer norm, because it is still very much like you are supposed to marry for convenience, for heirs, for children, etc. But you do have discussions around queerness and you have openly queer characters. So it kind of counts. The next one is a coastal or island setting. So the story features a major setting that is near or surrounded by the sea, and hard hard mode is the book also features seafaring. And for this one, I have gone with Fault by Lumen Reese, which is a contemporary horror fantasy in which we have had this big deep sea monster arise from the bottom of the sea, and it created absolute devastation across LA, which is, well, across California, which is where our protagonist is from. However, she was away on business and she left her daughters in the care of their babysitter, and then when the disaster happened, the babysitter lost sight of her daughters, and now her daughters are presumed dead. But she wants to go to the bottom of the ocean to go and retrieve her daughters' bodies, mostly to assuage her own guilt. Also, I think it's kind of like a slightly suicidal thing as well, where what's the point in continuing without her daughters, and her being absent and not being there while this was happening because she was away on business. And it was a very, very interesting discussion. One of the things that I really love about Lumen Reese's writing is that she will take a concept, like in this case, like a big sea monster, and use it to discuss something else entirely. And I really, really liked that about this story in particular. So I decided I would mention this because Lumen Reese doesn't get talked about at all, as far as I'm aware, on the Booknet, so I thought I would mention her here. The next one we have is Druids, which is a book that heavily features druids. This can be a classic druid, a priest, or a magician in Celtic lore, or a magic user whose powers stem from nature. For this one, I have gone with The Wolf in the Whale by Jordana Max Brodsky. In this, we are following Omat, who is the heir to become the next shaman of their people. Omat, being a shaman and the way they commune with animals and nature, it seemed very druid-like. I understand that shamanism and druidry have a lot of overlap. They're just from different cultures. So to me, it seemed like an appropriate option for this square. I loved this book. It was such a good story and it's so beautifully written. This is another one that is literary fantasy and I would highly recommend that you check it out. And it's just one that I think doesn't get talked about enough, especially if you talk about Norse mythology books. This one is a combination of both Inuit and Norse mythologies and the intersection of the two cultures historically as well. So it was a very fascinating story, and the discussion around the lack of success that the Vikings had in the Americas versus the success that the Inuit had in taking over certain territories so they could survive. So overall, I had a really good time with this book. It's beautifully written. It has really good themes. I really loved the characters as well, which in literary fantasy a lot of the time seem to take a backseat to the themes and the plot. So I was really glad to have read it. The next one is a book featuring robots, which is to read a book that features robots, androids, clockwork machines, or automatons. And the hard mode is that the robot is the protagonist. Now, I did reread the Boot series with my son last year. He started the first book at the end of 2022, and then we read books 2 and 3 throughout the year. This one features even more characters that are androids and or robots, so I figured I would use this one. But we have, Boot the creatures, and Boot is the protagonist, and he is this robot that looks like a tiny version of Baymax. So it's like if Baymax and Eva from WALL-E had a baby, you've got Boot. And it's a cute middle grade story with a robot protagonist. I don't have a huge amount to say on it. I've talked about it on the channel before, like, I don't know, 2 years ago or something. And as I said, I just reread it with my son, so I don't have huge thoughts on it. But it was a fun time and it works for the prompt. And then the final square, and oh my god, I cannot breathe. I've been talking for so long. But the final square is a sequel. So it's a read a book that is a sequel to another SFF book. And for hard mode, it's book 3 or on in the series. So I went with the book that is the highest number in the series that I read last year, if that makes sense. And I've gone with book 5 of the Memoirs of Lady Trent. I appreciate that there is a sequel story, but it's not part of the main series. So I've gone with book 5 that is concisely book 5, and that is Within the Sanctuary of Wings by Marie Brennan. As I said, book 5 in the Memoirs of Lady Trent series, which starts with the natural history of dragons. This one is an adult epic fantasy in which we are following Isabella Camphurst, Lady Trent, as she discovers dragons and she becomes the foremost academic within dragonology, and it's how she goes from being a woman of her time, because this is a pseudo-Victorian setting, and how she goes to becoming one of the most acclaimed academics in dragons as a dragon naturalist. It's how she goes from being just a young woman with a passion through to her being a well-respected woman in academia. and I love this series so much. It had so many themes, so many discussions. It was very intelligently done, very interesting, and I loved the characters, I loved the setting, and for the most part just an absolutely fantastic book. But that is it for me for today. So I hope that you have gotten at least a book recommendation from this, if nothing else. I think I did pretty good given I wasn't actually aiming to complete the Reddit fantasy at all, so I'm pretty happy with that. As I said, most of them I've managed to do on hard mode as well. So that is all from me for today, so hopefully I'll be able to catch you in another one soon. Bye!